The ancient forest held its breath as the temperature plummeted lower than it had in decades. The biting cold of -28 degrees Celsius tore through the barren trees, turning every exhaled breath into ice crystals that lingered in the air. In this unforgiving landscape, a mother bear's heart pounded with growing desperation. Her 3 small cubs huddled close against her, their tiny bodies shivering despite their thick winter coats as the merciless wind sliced through their fur like invisible blades. Sarah, as the locals had named her, was no ordinary black bear. For 6 years, she had roamed these woods, earning a reputation among wildlife researchers for her remarkable intelligence and cautious nature. But tonight, all her instincts and experience seemed useless against nature's fury. Winter had arrived too soon, catching her and her cubs unprepared, before they could build enough fat reserves or find a safe den for hibernation. The youngest cub whimpered, its voice barely audible over the howling wind. The sound tore at Sarah's heart, awakening an ancient fear that every mother knows, the fear of failing to protect her young. The other 2 cubs pressed closer, their small bodies trembling more violently with each passing minute. The family had been wandering for hours in search of shelter, but every potential den they found was either already occupied by other desperate creatures or exposed to the merciless wind. Their usual winter den, a deep cave in the northern valley, had collapsed during the autumn storms. Sarah had spent weeks searching for a new refuge, but winter had arrived like a thief in the night, stealing away their precious preparation time. The forest, once abundant with resources, had become a frozen wasteland. The streams were locked in ice, the berry bushes stood barren, and the ground was too frozen to dig for roots. Through the darkness, Sarah's keen nose caught an unfamiliar scent. Something different from the usual aromas of pine, earth, and wild creatures. It was the scent of warmth, of life, of something she would normally avoid at all costs. Under normal circumstances, every instinct in her would scream at her to turn away, to protect her cubs by keeping them far from human territory. But these were not normal circumstances. Another whimper from her cubs, weaker this time, made the decision for her. The mother bear lifted her head, testing the wind. The scent grew stronger, pulling her toward a clearing ahead. Her massive paws, numb from the cold, pressed forward with determined purpose. Each step was a battle against her instincts, each movement bringing them closer to the one thing she had always taught her cubs to fear. Through the swirling curtain of snow, lights appeared, warm, yellow lights that promised shelter from the deadly cold. The sight filled Sarah with equal measures of hope and terror. In all her years in the wild, she had never voluntarily approached a human structure. But as the youngest cub stumbled, its small body nearly frozen, she knew they had run out of options. The cold was no longer just uncomfortable. It had become their enemy, a silent killer that would claim her cubs if she didn't act soon. The mother bear paused at the edge of the forest, her dark eyes fixed on the isolated cabin. Her cubs huddled beneath her, barely moving now. The wind howled louder, as if mocking her dilemma. Stay in the forest and watch her cubs freeze, or risk everything by approaching the human dwelling. Nature versus desperation. Instinct versus maternal love. 20 yards from the cabin's front porch, the frozen branches cracked beneath Sarah's weight. The snow had grown deeper here, reaching past her cubs' bellies, making each step a battle for their tiny legs. The security lights suddenly blazed to life, bathing the snow-covered ground in harsh brightness. Sarah's muscles tensed, ready to flee, but her cubs' condition anchored her in place. The bright light revealed their desperate state. Their fur, usually fluffy and thick, was matted with ice. The cubs' eyes, normally bright with curiosity, had grown dull with exhaustion and cold. Inside the cabin, Tom Miller lowered his worn copy of Jack London's stories. At 63, he had chosen this solitary life in the mountains after retiring from his wildlife photography career. The walls of his cabin were adorned with photos of the local wildlife, including several of a familiar black bear he had photographed over the years. The security lights activation was nothing unusual in itself, but something about the heavy movement outside felt different from the usual nighttime visitors. The youngest cub collapsed into the snow, its small body almost motionless. Sarah gently gripped its scruff with her teeth, lifting the nearly frozen cub. The other 2 pressed against her legs, their shivering growing weaker. The scent of wood smoke and warmth pulled them forward, toward the wooden steps of the porch. Each step felt like an eternity, the distance between forest and cabin now seeming vast and exposed. Tom rose from his chair, his movements careful and quiet. Living in bear country had taught him caution, but also respect for these powerful creatures. The wind's howl couldn't quite mask the sound of something large moving onto his porch. Through the frost-covered window, he caught a glimpse of dark shapes, his breath caught in his throat. A bear. Not just any bear, but one he recognized from his photographs. Sarah, and she had cubs with her. The mother bear reached the cabin's door, her presence triggering another security light. The sudden brightness revealed the full desperation of their situation. Ice crystals clung to their fur like tiny daggers. The cubs huddled together, their small bodies pressed against the door, drawn to the warmth seeping through the cracks. Sarah stood over them protectively, her dark eyes alert despite her exhaustion. Inside, Tom watched in astonishment. In 15 years of living here, he had never seen anything like this. The bears weren't acting aggressively or searching for food. They were seeking shelter. The smallest cub lay motionless in the snow, barely breathing. The sight stirred something deep in Tom's heart. He had spent his life observing and photographing these magnificent creatures, but never had he seen such a clear display of maternal desperation. Sarah placed her paw against the door, not aggressively, but with a gentle pressure. The wood creaked softly. Her eyes found Tom's through the window, and in that moment, something passed between them. A silent understanding, a desperate mother seeking help from the only source available. The wind howled louder, driving more snow onto the porch, partially burying the weakened cubs. Tom knew the risks. Every rational thought told him to stay inside, to let nature take its course. But as he watched the mother bear trying to shelter her cubs from the brutal cold, he realized he couldn't just stand by and watch them freeze to death. His hand moved toward the door handle, his heart pounding with equal measures of fear and determination. The mother bear's eyes never left him, watching his every movement. There was intelligence in those eyes and something more. Trust? Desperation? Perhaps both. The cubs whimpered weakly, the sound barely audible through the door, but it pierced Tom's heart like an arrow. The temperature was still dropping, and without help, these cubs wouldn't survive the night. Tom's fingers wrapped around the door handle, his breath visible in the cold air that seeped through the cabin's cracks. Years of wilderness experience screamed at him to stop, to think rationally, but something more powerful than reason guided his actions now. With deliberate slowness, he turned the handle, creating a small gap between door and frame. The mother bear backed up slightly, positioning herself between her cubs and the opening door. Steam rose from her fur as the warm cabin air met the frozen night. The cubs, barely conscious now, lay in small heaps of ice-covered fur on the porch. Tom's heart nearly stopped when he realized the smallest one wasn't moving at all. In all his years of wildlife photography, Tom had documented countless animal behaviors, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. Sarah stood her ground, but her posture wasn't threatening. Her eyes held an almost human-like intelligence as she watched him, her breath coming in white puffs in the frozen air. She made a soft sound, not a growl, but something between a whimper and a moan that seemed to convey her desperation. The cabin's warmth spilled out onto the porch, and the two conscious cubs lifted their heads weakly toward it. Tom opened the door wider, moving backward into his living room with slow, deliberate steps. His mind raced through everything he knew about black bears. They rarely attacked humans unprovoked. Sarah, in particular, had never shown aggression toward people in all the years she'd been known to the local wildlife community. "Easy now," Tom whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind. "Easy, girl." He kept his movements slow and predictable as he retreated further into the room. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls decorated with his wildlife photographs. Among them were several of Sarah herself, taken over the years, including one from last spring with her newborn cubs. Sarah made her decision. With gentle teeth, she picked up her motionless cub. The other two struggled to their feet, swaying with exhaustion. Tom held his breath as the massive bear stepped into his cabin, her powerful frame filling the doorway. Snow fell from her fur onto his wooden floor, melting instantly in the warmth. The two stronger cubs stumbled in behind her, drawn by the heat of the fire. Tom backed away toward his kitchen, giving them space. His camera sat on the counter, but for once he had no interest in documentation. This wasn't a photo opportunity. This was about survival. Sarah placed her smallest cub near the hearth, her movements surprisingly gentle for such a powerful creature. The tiny bear lay still, its fur encased in ice. The mother bear nudged her cub, making soft sounds of distress. The other two cubs collapsed nearby, their small bodies shivering violently as they began to thaw. Tom watched as Sarah licked her motionless cub, trying to warm it. Her actions were so fundamentally maternal, so desperate, that Tom felt tears forming in his eyes. Without thinking about the danger, Tom took his heaviest blanket from the couch. Sarah watched him intently but made no aggressive moves as he slowly approached. With infinite care, he placed the blanket near the cubs, within reach of the mother bear. Sarah sniffed it cautiously, then used her nose to push it toward her littlest one. The next few minutes felt like hours as they waited for any sign of life from the smallest cub. Sarah continued to lick and nuzzle her baby, her massive body shielding all three cubs from any potential threat. Tom remained perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. Finally, the tiny bear twitched and let out a weak whimper. Sarah's relief was almost palpable as she gathered all three cubs closer to her. The night deepened as the temperature outside continued to plummet. Inside the cabin, an extraordinary scene unfolded. Tom moved with careful precision in his own home, maintaining a respectful distance from his unexpected guests. The mother bear had positioned herself between her cubs and the rest of the room, creating a protective barrier while allowing them to absorb the life-saving warmth from the fire. The smallest cub gradually showed more signs of life, its tiny body trembling as it began to warm up. Tom kept feeding wood into the fireplace, each movement slow and telegraphed. The crackling flames cast a golden glow over the bear's wet fur, steam rising as the ice melted away. Sarah watched him constantly, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight, but her posture remained calm and non-threatening. From his kitchen, Tom prepared warm honey water in a large, shallow pan. His hands shook slightly as he worked, still processing the surreal situation. 600 pounds of black bear occupied his living room, yet somehow it felt right. Natural almost. He had spent his life observing wildlife, but this was different. This was participation. The cubs began to show more energy as their body temperatures normalized. The two stronger ones huddled close to their mother, occasionally lifting their head to sniff the air curiously. The smallest one, though still weak, had managed to nurse a little, which Tom knew was a promising sign. Sarah occasionally licked her cubs, her massive tongue gentle against their small bodies. With infinite patience, Tom placed the pan of honey water within reach of the bears, then retreated. Sarah investigated the offering, sniffing carefully before allowing her cubs to drink. The warm liquid seemed to revive them further, their movements becoming more coordinated. The sight of the cubs drinking gave Tom an idea. He quietly began preparing more substantial food, something that would help them regain their strength. Hours passed. The wind outside howled with increasing fury, rattling the cabin's windows. Tom maintained the fire's warmth, moving about his home like a guest in his own space. He spoke softly, not directly to the bears, but in a quiet monologue that seemed to keep everyone calm. Sarah appeared to recognize his voice, her ears moving slightly to track the sound. By midnight, the cubs had recovered enough to become curious about their surroundings. They stayed close to their mother, but watched Tom with increasing interest. The smallest one, now able to move about, seemed particularly fascinated by the dancing shadows cast by the fire. Sarah remained alert but relaxed enough to allow her cubs this limited exploration. Tom settled into his armchair, maintaining the unspoken boundaries they had established. His camera remained untouched. Some moments weren't meant to be captured on film. This was about trust, about survival, about something deeper than documentation. Through his window, he could see the snow building up outside. The storm that had driven this family to seek help showed no signs of relenting. As the night wore on, Sarah's vigilance began to ease slightly. Her body language shifted from defensive to merely protective. She allowed herself to rest, though never fully sleeping. Her body curled around her cubs. The little ones, exhausted from their ordeal, fell into deep sleep, their breathing now strong and steady. The smallest cub occasionally twitched in its sleep, prompting Sarah to gently nuzzle it, as if reassuring herself of its recovery. The following days brought heavy snowfall that made returning to the wilderness impossible. Tom's cabin became an unlikely sanctuary, where the barriers between human and wild gradually softened. Each morning, he would wake to find Sarah alert but peaceful, her cubs growing stronger under her constant care. The smallest one, whom Tom had silently named Lucky, showed remarkable recovery, becoming as playful as its siblings. Tom established a routine that seemed to comfort both him and his wild guests. He would prepare their food early, setting it in their claimed corner before retreating to make his own breakfast. Sarah watched these preparations with intelligent eyes, seeming to understand the pattern. The cubs grew bolder, though still staying within the protective radius of their mother. They would watch Tom's movements with obvious curiosity, their small heads following him as he went about his daily tasks. Word of the unusual situation spread through the small mountain community. Tom's satellite phone rang frequently with calls from wildlife officials and local rangers. He assured them everything was under control, explaining how Sarah maintained a respectful boundary and showed no aggression. The officials were skeptical but trusted Tom's experience. After all, he had spent decades studying these animals. From his years of wildlife photography, Tom recognized signs of intelligence in Sarah that went beyond basic animal instinct. She seemed to understand that they were temporary guests, never marking territory or showing possessiveness over spaces in the cabin. She kept her cubs from damaging furniture or exploring too far, using soft grunts and gentle nudges to guide their behavior. One particularly cold morning, Tom witnessed something extraordinary. He had been reading in his chair when Lucky stumbled while playing, bumping into the coffee table. Before Tom could react, Sarah had already moved, carefully steadying the table with her paw to prevent a lamp from falling. The deliberate care in her actions spoke of an awareness that surprised even Tom, who had spent his life observing bears. The cubs grew stronger each day, their playful antics bringing unexpected joy to the cabin. They would wrestle near the fireplace, their little growls and tumbles making Tom smile despite himself. Sarah would watch them with what could only be described as maternal pride, occasionally joining their play with gentle pats and nudges. These moments made Tom grateful he had chosen to help, despite the risks. Local photographers and news crews gathered at the edge of Tom's property, hoping to document this extraordinary story. He kept them at bay, understanding that Sarah's trust was a privilege that required protection. Through his window, he could see their distant figures, but the heavy snow in his remote location maintained the privacy this unique situation required. At night, when the cubs slept deeply, Sarah would sometimes catch Tom's eye across the room. In those quiet moments, he felt a deep connection with this wild creature who had chosen to trust him. He would speak softly, telling her about his life, his years in the wilderness, and how she had appeared in many of his photographs before this extraordinary encounter. She would listen, her eyes reflecting the firelight, occasionally tilting her head as if understanding. The weather reports promised improvement soon, and Tom felt a mixture of relief and sadness. He knew this temporary arrangement had to end, that Sarah and her cubs belonged in the wild. But something profound had happened in these days of shared space and mutual trust. He had witnessed a side of wildlife that few humans ever see, a demonstration of intelligence and adaptation that challenged everything he thought he knew about these creatures. After a week of fierce winter storms, the morning dawned clear and bright. Sunlight sparkled on the deep snow, and the temperature began to rise for the first time since Sarah and her cubs had sought shelter. Tom stood at his window, watching the icicles drip from his roof, knowing that this marked the end of their extraordinary time together. The forecast promised continued warming, a break in the brutal cold that had forced this unique coexistence. Inside the cabin, Sarah too seemed to sense the change. She spent more time looking out the windows, her nose twitching at the scents carried by the warmer air. The cubs, now fully recovered and bursting with energy, played with increased vigor. Lucky, the smallest one, who had nearly frozen that first night, had become the most adventurous, often leading its siblings in playful chases around their designated corner. Tom began preparing for their departure, though his heart felt unexpectedly heavy. He gathered extra food they could take with them, creating a small stockpile that would help them transition back to the wild. Sarah watched these preparations with her usual intelligence, her eyes following his movements as if understanding their significance. The cubs, however, remained blissfully unaware, tumbling and playing as they had every day. Throughout the morning, Tom observed subtle changes in Sarah's behavior. She began gathering her cubs more frequently, keeping them closer, preparing them in her own way. She made soft, grunting sounds that seemed to carry meaning, as the cubs became gradually more attentive to her. The playfulness of the previous days gave way to a more focused energy, an awakening of their wild instincts. Around noon, Sarah rose to her full height, her decision made. The cubs immediately gathered around her, responding to some unspoken signal. Tom stood perfectly still, understanding that this moment needed to unfold naturally. Sarah led her cubs to the door, but then did something unexpected. She turned and looked directly at Tom, holding his gaze for a long moment. Her eyes, dark and intelligent, seemed to convey something beyond what humans typically attribute to wild animals. Tom slowly moved to open the door, maintaining the careful movements that had characterized their time together. The sudden rush of fresh air seemed to awaken something in the cubs. They became more alert, their noses lifting to catch the wild scents they had been born to follow. The snow had melted enough to create a clear path back to the forest, nature's way of easing their return. Sarah led her family out onto the porch, each step deliberate. The cubs paused briefly, looking back at the cabin that had sheltered them through the worst of the storm. Lucky, in particular, seemed reluctant to leave, taking an extra moment to look at Tom. Sarah waited patiently, allowing her cubs this moment of transition. Then, with a soft grunt, she guided them down the steps and onto the snow-covered ground. Tom watched from his doorway as the Bear family made their way across his property. Their tracks in the snow told the story of their journey, 4 sets of paw prints leading back to the forest that was their true home. Just before they reached the tree line, Sarah paused once more. She turned, meeting Tom's eyes one final time, her cubs clustered around her legs. In that moment, Tom felt the privilege of having witnessed something extraordinary, a bridge between the wild and human worlds. As they disappeared into the forest, Tom reflected on how this experience had changed him. In all his years of wildlife photography, he had documented countless animal behaviors, but never had he been part of such an intimate interaction. Sarah had trusted him with her most precious possession, her cubs' lives, and that trust had created something profound. The forest seemed different now, more alive with possibility. Tom knew that while Sarah and her cubs would return to their wild ways, they had all been transformed by their time together. In the following weeks, he occasionally spotted them at the forest's edge, Sarah's distinctive form recognizable even at a distance. She would sometimes pause, acknowledging his presence before leading her cubs deeper into the woods. These brief encounters felt like a continuation of their connection, a reminder that sometimes the boundary between wild and tame was more fluid than humans imagine. After a week of fierce winter storms, the morning dawned clear and bright. Sunlight sparkled on the deep snow, and the temperature began to rise for the first time since Sarah and her cubs had sought shelter. Tom stood at his window, watching the icicles drip from his roof, knowing that this marked the end of their extraordinary time together. The forecast promised continued warming, a break in the brutal cold that had forced this unique coexistence. Inside the cabin, Sarah too seemed to sense the change. She spent more time looking out the windows, her nose twitching at the scents carried by the warmer air. The cubs, now fully recovered and bursting with energy, played with increased vigor. Lucky, the smallest one, who had nearly frozen that first night, had become the most adventurous, often leading its siblings in playful chases around their designated corner. Tom began preparing for their departure, though his heart felt unexpectedly heavy. He gathered extra food they could take with them, creating a small stockpile that would help them transition back to the wild. Sarah watched these preparations with her usual intelligence, her eyes following his movements as if understanding their significance. The cubs, however, remained blissfully unaware, tumbling and playing as they had every day. Throughout the morning, Tom observed subtle changes in Sarah's behavior. She began gathering her cubs more frequently, keeping them closer, preparing them in her own way. She made soft grunting sounds that seemed to carry meaning as the cubs became gradually more attentive to her. The playfulness of the previous days gave way to a more focused energy, an awakening of their wild instincts. Around noon, Sarah rose to her full height, her decision made. The cubs immediately gathered around her, responding to some unspoken signal. Tom stood perfectly still, understanding that this moment needed to unfold naturally. Sarah led her cubs to the door, but then did something unexpected. She turned and looked directly at Tom, holding his gaze for a long moment. Her eyes, dark and intelligent, seemed to convey something beyond what humans typically attribute to wild animals. The local wildlife community had been fascinated by this unprecedented event. Rangers and researchers documented everything from a respectful distance, understanding that this unique bond between man and bear could offer valuable insights into wildlife behavior during extreme weather conditions. Tom's phone had been ringing constantly with calls from scientists eager to learn from his experience. As Sarah and her cubs prepared to leave, Tom remembered every moment of their extraordinary week together. He thought about the night they arrived, nearly frozen and desperate, and marveled at how far they had come. The smallest cub, Lucky, had transformed from a motionless bundle of ice-covered fur into a playful, curious bear cub full of life. The mother bear's intelligence had surprised even Tom, who had spent decades studying wildlife. She had shown an understanding of boundaries, kept her cubs from damaging anything in the cabin, and even seemed to grasp the temporary nature of their arrangement. Her behavior challenged many commonly held beliefs about wild animals. Tom slowly moved to open the door, maintaining the careful movements that had characterized their time together. The sudden rush of fresh air seemed to awaken something in the cubs. They became more alert, their noses lifting to catch the wild scents they had been born to follow. The snow had melted enough to create a clear path back to the forest, nature's way of easing their return. Sarah led her family out onto the porch with deliberate steps. The cubs paused briefly, looking back at the cabin that had sheltered them through the worst of the storm. Lucky, in particular, seemed reluctant to leave, taking an extra moment to look at Tom. Sarah waited patiently, allowing her cubs this moment of transition. Then, with a soft grunt, she guided them down the steps and onto the snow-covered ground. Subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming wildlife stories that showcase the extraordinary bonds between humans and animals. Hit the notification bell to never miss our weekly updates featuring remarkable tales of survival, courage, and unexpected friendships from the wild.